third year, and while we hope for a political solution, a humanitarian tragedy continues to unfold before our eyes. The situation for Syrians is desperate. Life for those caught up in the spiraling violence is unbearable. As ordinary civilians fall into ever deeper despair, the humanitarian need is growing more urgent by the day. According to the United Nations estimates, the death toll is now 80,000. 8 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. Over 4.25 million have been driven from their homes by the fighting to other areas of Syria, with now well over 1.3 million refugees in neighboring countries. The majority of these refugees are women, children, and the elderly, more than half of whom are children below the age of 11, suffering first and foremost from psychological trauma. These figures are alarming, but from my own experience, having visited 2 camps in Turkey, I can tell you that they do not capture or convey the full extent of the crisis. The UNHCR itself conceded that the total numbers are far higher than they had been officially accounted for. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate rapidly as increased fighting and changing of control of towns and villages, in particular in the conflict areas, is driving more and more people out of the country. Beyond Syria's borders, the problems continue. For countries that have taken those refugees in, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Turkey, the burden they face in economic, security, and social terms on their energy, water, health, and educational facilities is huge and proving a serious challenge that frankly far exceeds their capabilities to cope with. Yes, I will.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. I agree entirely with what he's saying about the burden this is putting on Jordan in particular. Would you agree with me that more pressure should be put on the United Arab Emirates to actually contribute more to humanitarian relief?
I entirely agree with the Honourable Lady. I think that's the point I want to make in terms of the international community's responsibility, and that includes obviously the Gulf states. The scale of the humanitarian needs is continuing, as I say, to outstrip the support available, and in that context the risks will only soar. Particularly the pressure on Jordan's already scarce water, energy and education resources is enormous. Approximately 40,000 Syrian students have started attending classes in Jordanian schools, and health services are strained by the average daily influx of 3,000 refugees into Jordan alone. If that influx continues at that pace, we'll be looking at 1 million refugees in Jordan by the end of the year. So where is the European Union and the rest of the international community in this devastating and desperate hour? Many promises have been made, but not enough have been delivered. I find it dispiriting that we have collectively fallen so far short of our obligations to help the Syrian people caught up in the turmoil and to alleviate the burdens borne by the neighbouring host countries. Appeals for funding to provide food, water and other humanitarian aid inside Syria have received only meagre support, while the UN Refugee Agency says its appeal for $500 million was only 1/3 funded. As a result of the woeful state of funding, the UN and other aid organisations are able to reach just 1.5 million of the people in desperate need, and that number is probably somewhere in the region of 3 million people. The much vaunted January I'm very conscious of the time limit that Madam Deputy Speaker has placed on me, and therefore I'm not going to take any more interventions. There was a conference in January which pledged 1.5 billion. The Foreign Secretary reported yesterday that payments have now reached 71% of the amount pledged, but that's still nearly $500 million short. I think we can be proud of honouring our own financial commitments, but we know there are still countries who have not, and that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is not good enough. When the Foreign Secretary goes to Brussels on Monday, there must be progress on dialogue. And in the long term, the whole international community will have to pull together to find a solution to this conflict.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm pleased we're having this debate, and I hope that when the meeting comes about in Brussels, the government will not use its veto and therefore lead us into the danger of supplying arms to Syria. This has come about for some time now. The Foreign Office has been chatting quite openly about the question of possibly supplying arms, and indeed in a letter to me on the 22nd of April from the Minister, he said, as things stand today, there's going to be a strong case as we come towards the end of May for the lifting of the arms embargo on the Syrian National Coalition, or some very serious amendment to the EU arms embargo. I would just make the point that we will be supplying arms, as others have made, to people we don't know. We don't know where those arms will end up. We don't know how much worse the conflict will get as a result of that. And anyone that doubts the leakage of arms should think very carefully about the way the USA raced in to supply any amount of arms to any opposition in Afghanistan in 1979, and that gave birth to the Taliban and ultimately to Al-Qaeda. We should think very, very seriously before we do this, and I hope that we do not end up with any arms supplies or indeed any UK involvement in the conflict. There is a horrific situation, quite obviously, in Syria, with tens of thousands of dead already, hundreds of thousands of refugees in neighbouring countries, and indeed the situation is probably getting far worse for all of those. That's not to say there aren't huge internal conflicts within Syria, or that there weren't enormous abuses of human rights by the Assad regime, but the West has very selective memories on this. There was a time when Western governments were happy to cooperate with President Assad on many issues, and there was also the Assad regime was actually receiving very large numbers of refugees from Iraq, mainly Palestinians that were driven out of Iraq after the US invasion. So one just thinks of the plight, particularly of Palestinian people who have been driven from country to country to country for the past 60 years. That anger in those refugee camps will be the start of the conflicts and wars of tomorrow. There has to be a recognition of human rights and human justice. But this war is becoming a proxy war for all kinds of interests. Just think of the countries and organisations already involved, either by supplying arms, supplying funding, or supplying the euphemistically called non-lethal assistance. The European Union is clearly very involved. The United States is very clearly involved. Russia is very clearly involved in supplying arms to the Assad government and also to protecting its own base there. The Gulf cooperation countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, are supplying vast amounts of money and vast amounts of arms to the area. Iran feels under threat. Iran feels that it is next on the hit list of the Western countries, and therefore is helping, presumably in some form, the Assad regime. Turkey, as a neighbouring country, is both receiving refugees and supplying some weaponry and some assistance. Israel has now got involved with the reports of the bombing that took place last week, and in today's Guardian there is a report of a land incursion near the Golan Heights which was beaten off by some forces, we know not which. This is a time surely to reflect on the Western strategy in dealing with all the issues that we've been confronted with since 2001. Afghanistan, we've spent a lot of money and lost a lot of soldiers, and lots of civilians have died, and the country remains poor, corrupt and divided. Iraq is a place which is can hardly be called at peace. Libya, we went in with a no-fly zone. We spent an awful lot of money and time bombing large numbers of people, and one could hardly say there is a Western-style liberal democracy there at the present time. Syria was a colonial creation. The French were very good at oppressing Syrian nationalism in the 1920s, and now the country is in danger of splitting apart altogether. If there is to be a political solution, and this is what point I conclude on, the Minister said he wanted a political solution. The conference being planned looks increasingly like a conference to impose some kind of victorious solution. A conference has got to include all the countries of the region and all the parties that are involved in any form in this particular conflict, and that obviously must include Iran and must recognise the role that Israel is playing at the present time. The West were incapable of getting the nuclear non-proliferation treaty conference for a nuclear-free Middle East going. I hope they're more successful in getting this conference going. And the final point I make is, will the Minister give an absolute assurance that there will be a debate and a vote in this House before any precipitate action is taken, before any arms are supplied to anybody, so those of us that disagree with that will get the chance to express our dissent from that proposal.
Martin Horwood.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I first start with one note of criticism which doesn't actually relate to our policy in relation to Syria, but simply in relation to the scrutiny of European documents in this place. This Council decision was taken on the 28th of February, I think, if I'm correct. It was referred to this chamber by the European Scrutiny Committee back in March. It is now nearly June, and in fact the 3-month arms embargo to which the decision originally referred is nearly finished. This isn't a criticism of the Minister, and certainly not of the Chair, but I'm afraid government business managers must address this issue, and we collectively must try and do European scrutiny in a much more timely and effective fashion in this place. Can I strongly welcome much of what the Minister has said? In particular, I think his very strong emphasis on the main focus of British policy being the achievement of a peaceful political solution, and that has to be right, and that has to be our main objective in every decision we take. The Geneva peace process, which we hope will develop over the coming months, is central to this, and the role of Russia and other countries inside the region are critical to the process. There have been some, I think, those slightly ill-judged questions asked during this debate so far. The Honourable Member for Croydon South, who I think made a very wise contribution, did at one stage, though, ask if it would be legal for us to intervene in this way in the dispute in Syria. And yet I haven't heard anyone on the government benches saying that we should intervene. We are, in the end, talking only about the possible partial lifting or changing of an arms embargo in a country in which there is no universal arms embargo, and in fact arms are flowing into the country, funded by Russia in the case of the regime, supported by Iran and by Hezbollah, flowing to the jihadi elements like al-Nusra and possibly al-Qaeda, funded by all accounts from within the Gulf. And these arms are flowing in completely legally because of the lack of a UN arms embargo. The Honourable Member for Wolverhampton North East asked whether we were fuelling the fire. Well, it is quite difficult to see how you could fuel this anymore. There is already an inferno. In effect, the EU arms embargo is a little like a sticking plaster floating in a flood. The country is awash with arms already, and the most sophisticated arms are going to the regime, and I'm afraid to the jihadis who are actually gaining ground against other elements. And there is something that worries me in the tone of some of the contributions, and I have to say I admire in many respects the Honourable Member for Islington North, but I think he fell foul of this trap. To talk as if there simply is no democratic or moderate force present in the country, to simply ignore its existence, I think is making a really fatal error. We have fallen into this trap in so many parts of the world over past decades, where we have assumed that democracy and moderation and the rule of law could never exist in places like Latin America or Eastern Europe or Africa. And one after another, actually, the people of those continents and those places and those regions have shown that they are capable of fighting for freedom and democracy without falling into the hands of extremism. And the Arab Spring, if it taught us anything, showed us that Arabs too can be moderate, Arabs too can fight for democracy, Arabs too can resist the temptations of extremism. And the Syrian conflict did not begin with Western intervention at all. The Syrian conflict, well, I think the Honourable Member did strongly imply that. We'll check the record with both of us. The Syrian conflict began with Syrian people rising up against a dictatorship in exactly the same way as the conflicts began in Libya and Tunisia and in Egypt, and in fact are still tentatively going on in other countries. And if we simply talk as if this is an endless and inevitable bloodbath carried out by wild-eyed foreigners, then I think we do a grave injustice to those people who are trying to promote values that we would recognise. And the Syrian National Coalition has endorsed those kind of values. It has endorsed democracy and pluralism and the rule of law. And I am aware, and I'm sure there are laughter from behind me. I'm surprised they think it's funny, but I think that the Syrian National Coalition, the Free Syrian Army, are implicated in crimes, and those should be investigated, and we should put intense pressure on the coalition to clean up its act, to make sure its fighters try to respect civilian populations, and that we try our best to make these people who are clearly no angels behave in a way that we would feel proud to support. But to simply ignore them and to assume that this is going to end up as a Sunni-Shia battle between the Assad regime on the one side and jihadis on the other is, I think, could be an historic mistake. But the most important thing, as I've said already, is to try and do everything we can to support the Geneva process and to support a regional political solution. That has to involve Russia, who are critical to this process. It will, I think, inevitably draw in countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia, although whether or not it's practical to have those two in the Geneva Peace Conference, I'm not sure, because that might actually end up as more of a Sunni-Shia fight than ever before. But we have a political and diplomatic duty, but a moral obligation to try and make sure that this peace process works, and that, providing they haven't been annihilated in the meantime, that present partners in that peace process are those fighting for freedom and democracy and the rule of law.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, although this debate is somewhat retrospective, as pointed out by the Honourable Gentleman from Cheltenham, it does raise some important questions to consider regarding our current and prospective role in the conflict and in Syria. And I would like to echo the sentiments raised by the Honourable Member for North Dorset. I have spent 7 years travelling to Syria, and over that time I've had the opportunity to meet with Bashar Assad and members of the regime several times during that. And I think the tragedy unfolding for the silent middle within Syria is a tragedy to behold. It is a beautiful country that is being dismembered day by day. And I think we should think very carefully as to what our next steps are. So where are we today? On the one side, we have the Assad regime, which is responsible, as we've heard, for over 80,000 deaths, over 1 million refugees, and over 4 million displaced people internally. The regime itself has 300,000 soldiers, plus the dreaded Shabiha. It has 16,000 pieces of heavy artillery. It has an air force at its disposal, and it has very robust air defenses supplied by the Russians. It also indeed has the Russians on its side, the Russians providing hardware such as S-300s, the Kont surface-to-ship missiles, again a very robust, the most robust air defense system in the Middle East other than the Israelis, plus military advisors who are increasing day by day. It also has the Iranians, who are providing the Revolutionary Guard, who are providing strategic advice. It's got Hezbollah on its side. It's got electronic intelligence provided by the Iranians. It's got money provided by the Iranians. It's got arms provided by the Iranians. And it's even got the Shabiha today being formed into a national defense brigade by the Iranians themselves, who are giving direction. What have we got on the opposition side? Simply, we have two groups who are highly fragmented. We've got the FSA, which has about 30,000 people, led by General Idris, but who essentially have just small arms at their disposal. And on the other side, as we've heard from many colleagues, we've got the Salafis, who have about 3,000 to 5,000 people, but who themselves are very fragmented. We've heard about Jabhat al-Nusra, but we've got Liwa al-Islam, we've got Liwa al-Sakur, and we've got Kata'ib, Ahrar al-Sham, amongst other Islamists there who are fighting. So what do we have? We have an asymmetrical war. An asymmetrical war in which Bashar Assad has no incentive whatsoever to negotiate seriously. So what are our options? Our options are fourfold. One is a containment strategy, which would prevent the conflict from spreading, but unfortunately, a containment strategy would just merely lead to more death. We then have a no-fly zone, as proposed by the member for Ilford South. That would indeed tip the balance, but a no-fly zone would put our Air Force, our pilots' lives at risk, and I don't believe the military establishment in this country has any appetite after Iraq and Afghanistan to risk our Air Force pilots' lives. The third option is lifting the arms embargo. This, I believe, would put pressure on Bashar Assad. However, the point made by the member for Islington North, and I suspect made by the member for Billericay when he gets his opportunity, is there is a risk indeed that these arms may or may not fall into the arms of the opposition. But I think the signal we would send by lifting the arms embargo would put pressure on the regime. And the final strategy is one of a radical diplomatic engagement strategy where we have two opportunities before us. One is the UK holds the presidency of the UN Security Council next month. And secondly, there are Iranian elections next month, which may provide an option for us to press the reset button regarding engagement with Iran. So we need to engage, as the member for Islington North said, with all parties. The Gulf states, Turkey, UK, EU, the US, as well as Syria, Russia, and Iran. So to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, time is running out. We must show Bashar Assad at Geneva he is at the last chance saloon. And I would encourage the Foreign Secretary to put pressure through a two-pronged strategy of radical diplomatic engagement with all parties, coupled with a real threat of lethal support to the FSA. Only then will there be a real prospect to end the tragedy unfolding in Syria.
There are two more speakers. If each takes 5 minutes and no more, we'll have a few minutes for the Minister at the end. Robert Halford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are 3 points I want to raise during this debate. First, I welcome the renewal of restrictive measures against Syria and any amendments that increase pressure on the Assad regime, but I fear that they don't go far enough. Second, the government and the EU need to take further action against groups, particularly Hezbollah, supporting the Syrian regime. And thirdly, this is not about intervention, but muscular enlightenment, and we must act now. I have to say I was disappointed with the Honourable Lady who said that the government's actions were fueling the conflict. The government have taken every diplomatic course, and yet 80,000 people have been killed in the last 3 years. Now, I strongly support the McCain plan, which says that we need to work together as an international community to protect civilians by suppressing Assad's air defences. The advantages of following this policy are plentiful. These would give a safe space where essential humanitarian aid could be given out, especially with medical supplies, food and water. It would be a valuable area where the anti-Assad forces could train and become a more effective fighting force. Now, we talk about the problem with arming the opposition, but the fact is that because we've done nothing, I'm not talking about our country, but because the free world has done nothing over the last 2 years, it is inevitable that the Islamists have gone into the vacuum. And don't forget, organisations like Hezbollah are actually arming the Islamic groups, and that's why we have to identify the correct opposition groups, the people who believe in a more democratic and free Syria, and I believe that we can actually do that. Now, I touched in the intervention on the Minister about chemical weapons. We have to look to find out the companies who've actually supplied the Assad regime with chemical materials, because we now know that up to 500 companies supplied Saddam Hussein with the chemical weapons that allowed him to attack Halabja, and I hope very much that the government will look into that. We need to prescribe Hezbollah, not just the armed wing, but the political wing, because of their activities in supporting the Assad regime and supporting the suppression of the people. Now, number 10 Downing Street said in April 2013, there is growing evidence that the Assad regime has used chemical weapons. Now, the Honourable Gentleman said we need evidence, but we've seen it on our BBC television. I do not want to go back 25 years and let another Halabja happen, and it looks like that it is coming. So we have to take action now. We've done everything we can. We have gone, I won't give away because the friend wants to speak. We've done everything possible diplomatically, and it is right that we take further action in supporting in supporting the right opposition groups, creating safe havens, and showing people that actually we want to stop mass genocide.
Very much. I suggest to my right honourable friend that Syria is a melting pot for a proxy war that is being fought out either directly or indirectly at various levels. Whether it is Sunni versus Shia Muslim, whether it is the West versus China or Russia, whether it is the concern of minorities within the country, such as the Alawites and the Christians, against what could perhaps follow, whether it's Iran versus Saudi Arabia. It's a crossing point for conflict, and I urge the Minister and indeed the coalition government to think very carefully before it pours more arms into a conflict which can not only just escalate the violence within this civil war, but could lead to an escalation of an arms race beyond Syria's borders, which could be a mistake at the end of the day of historic proportions. And I do think history, Madam Deputy Speaker, is very important here. Our track record at arming groups or individuals is not good, no matter what anybody says. We armed the Mujahideen and found that probably there's a fair chance that a good number of those weapons were then used against us. We armed Saddam Hussein, supported him in his war against Iran, for example, and again, probably some of those weapons were pointed against us. History is important. History teaches us that if you support, if you intervene in regimes, in civil wars, in conflicts, then often what you're trying to remove, what you're trying to put right, gets embedded even further. If you look at, since the Second World War, our efforts to take on communist regimes around the world, whether it was Korea or China or Vietnam, those regimes are still in place despite essentially in place despite Western interventions. And then if we want to try and create a sort of stability and liberal democracy in our making, we only have to look at what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. Democracy is not flourishing there. Despite the high cost in lives and treasure, it is flourishing in North Africa and other regions of the Middle East, where the West essentially has played a much more minor role. So I urge the government to think very carefully before going down this road of arming the rebels. And the Minister is right to say that's not the very narrow debate we're having here tonight, and I accept that. But he must also accept that we are debating an EU Council decision that took place at the end of February, on the 28th of February. It is up for renewal, or certainly revisiting on the 1st of June. And the Minister cannot deny that the government has been flying kites on this issue. So we are right to raise it on the floor of the House tonight, particularly given that this decision will be revisited very, very shortly, as I understand it, on the 1st of June. And I would ask the Minister to consider one or two other points as well. We do not know very much about the rebel forces. What we do know is that some of them are linked to Al-Qaeda, some of them have committed atrocities, and yet the idea that we can somehow track and trace weaponry that we put into Syria because we would only deal with the moderate elements, I think is beyond the capability of any Western governments unless we had troops on the ground to monitor this more closely. And I'm sure the Minister isn't going to suggest that course of action. And there can be little doubt that the more weapons you put into a conflict, the more you escalate the violence. It beggars belief, the concept that you can put weapons into essentially a civil war, and somehow it's not going to inflate or escalate the violence. Of course it will. And this is why Oxfam and a number of other charities who have people on the ground have come out very publicly over the last week or two to say, do not do it. Do not go down this road, because bad things will happen. We know there's a humanitarian crisis there already, but pouring more weapons into the conflict cannot do the conflict any good, and it can only escalate the violence within the country. So within the minute I have left, Mr. Speaker, I would urge instead that the front bench focuses on the diplomacy. Diplomacy has not run its course yet. We have the Russian conference, or the conference suggested by the Russians. We should pursue that and pursue it to the very end. We should also do what we can on the humanitarian side. There is more that can be done. There was a number of suggestions. Certainly the member from North Dorset made the point that we could be doing more from a humanitarian point of view, and we should be exploring that. But for one last time, Mr. Speaker, I urge the front bench to restrain from its exploring of the view that we should arm the rebels. Syria is the crossing point of a conflict here. Arm them, it could escalate, and we could be very sorry for what follows. Minister Byrd.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank all colleagues for the contribution in a very short debate. We've covered a lot of ground, and I do appreciate the way in which colleagues have handled it. As my honourable friend, the member for Bournemouth East, reminded me from the line from Argo, but could be repeated in a number of other films, there are no good choices. They're all bad choices, and what we're trying to do is make the best of a very difficult situation. The contribution from virtually every colleague understood the complexity and the difficulty of the situation, and the fact that after 2 years of unrelenting killing by the regime, we were left with some very difficult choices indeed. Let me do my best to cover a number of things, but colleagues will appreciate I may not be able to cover every point and every colleague that spoke. To the Honourable Lady, a number of questions raised in the Honourable Lady's remarks. If she looks back on the intervention, she'll see a number of answers to that, like the balance of weaponry and diversion. I understand the issues, and I try to do my best to deal with them. On the basis of what the government is seeking to do with the European Union partners, I would say to her, we're seeking consensus. These sanctions stand or fall by consensus, and it's clearly the aim and the determination of the government to try and get consensus within the EU. But if consensus is not possible and the sanctions fall, we would be prepared to introduce domestic sanctions in order to cover the gap. But it's the intention and the determination that it should be by consensus. I reiterate to the House, as I've sought to do, that the policy remains that we're seeking a political solution. A number of the contributions to the debate were anticipating a point that we have not reached. As my honourable friend, the member for Basildon and Billericay says, that's not illegitimate to do in this debate, but I do firmly counsel colleagues that questions about whether or not we should arm are not on the table. But again, as he and other colleagues might imagine, all the issues that have been raised here about the risks, the dangers, the issues of diversion, he cannot but think for a second that those matters are not top of concerns of colleagues in the Foreign Office and throughout government. But as a number of colleagues have said, the situation is already dire. Both the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, the member for Cheltenham, spoke about what was already there, as referred to by other colleagues. My honourable friend, the member for North Dorset, spoke about the humanitarian situation, and did others. It is not that a dramatic change in the situation by an EU arms embargo will suddenly transform a situation for the worse. The situation is already horrendous. We're trying to do something that will be different. The purpose of seeking to lift the arms embargo is to give the flexibility, which my honourable friend, the member for Croydon South, and my honourable friend, the member for Braintree, both referred to. It gives flexibility. It assists the moderates against the extremists. It assists the politicians against those who wish to see solely a military solution. It gives flexibility in circumstances which we do not know. Unless that's lifted, the process of then lifting it in difficult circumstances would be almost impossible. But decisions after that, quite rightly, will be of enormous complexity and difficulty, and the government is well seized in relation to it. I cannot stress often enough either to the House the importance the government places on the current political process and the urgency in relation to that. That is foremost in all our minds. Colleagues across the House have spoken about the impossibility of the military situation. That is why it's so important that the Foreign Secretary is backed wholeheartedly in the efforts he's making for peace with working with others, and that's what he is doing. Could I just finally sort of turn to the point about coming to the House and all that? And I think it's important to repeat the Foreign Secretary's remarks of yesterday, not just his final point, but the one he made just just earlier to it. He said this, men, women and children suffering virtually every kind of weapon that man has ever invented being dropped on them, while most of the world denies them the means to defend themselves. If we come to a choice about that, it is a very important foreign policy and moral choice, which of course should be discussed fully in the House. He drew attention both to the urgency of the situation, what is happening at the moment, and his determination to have the matter fully discussed.
Order. Under the standing order, I must now put the question. The question is as on the order paper. As many as I've got opinion say aye. Aye. For the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We come now to motion number 6. Indeed, with the leave of the House, if colleagues are content, I'll take motion 6, 7 and 8, respectively, on financial assistance to industry, on education, and again on education together.
I beg to move 6, 7 and 8.
Thank you. The question is as on the order paper in respect of motions 6, 7 and 8. As many as I've got opinion say aye. Aye. For the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Motion number 9 on the Welsh Grand Committee. The whip to move.
I beg to move.
Thank you. The question is as on the order paper. As many as I've got opinion say aye. Aye. For the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Motion number 10 on financial assistance to industry. The whip to move.
I beg to move.
Thank you. The question is as on the order paper. As many as I've got opinion say aye. Aye. For the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Petitions. Dr. Matthew Offord.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present a petition on behalf of residents of Hendon and specifically on behalf of the Broadfields Estate Residents Association. The petitioners are opposing the Avanti House School development on the Broadfields Estate in Edgware. Petitioners note that the Avanti House School have identified land between Heartland Drive and Broadfields Primary School for a new school which could accommodate 1,680 pupils, and that sports pitches are planned to be built on greenbelt land. The petitioners do not believe that the area can accommodate this, and the proposed school will not actually serve the Broadfields area or indeed the London Borough of Barnet. Furthermore, pupils would arrive by cars and buses, adding to already congested roads, and that the north part of the Broadfields estate is not only surrounded by greenbelt, but is only accessible by 2 roads, which is able to handle residential traffic. The development threatens to cause traffic chaos and ruin the lives of the local community. Therefore, the petitioners request that the House of Commons urge the government not to support the relocation of Avanti House School to the Broadfields site in Edgware, and draw attention to this petition and to a second submitted to Barnet Council containing 1,002 signatures.
Petition objections to a free school, Edgware.
Petition. Mr. Chris Rouet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to present this following petition to Parliament on behalf of the residents of Rhyl and indeed the Valley of Clwyd, who are totally opposed to the proposal by Post Office Limited to franchise Rhyl Crown Post Office. They believe that this proposal will severely damage the provision of services in Rhyl, especially to the elderly, and they call upon the Post Offices Limited to withdraw their proposal and to retain Rhyl Crown Post Office. The petition of those concerned about the proposed closure of Rhyl Crown Post Office declares that Rhyl Crown Post Office should remain within the Crown network and not become a franchise. The petitioners believe that the proposal for a franchise will severely damage the provisions of services in Rhyl. The petitioners therefore request that the House of Commons urges the Minister of State for Business and Enterprise to protect the much-loved public services, and the petitioners remain, etc.
Petition, closure of Rhyl Crown Post Office.
Order, we come now to the adjournment. The whip to move.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mr. Bob Neal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I say it's a pleasure to be able to raise this issue in this debate, and delighted to see a number of honourable members still here as we come towards closing time, which might be an appropriate metaphor for the subject of this debate. I hope not for the porcupine. And what I wanted to do, briefly, Mr. Speaker, if I may, is to set out what seems to me a particularly concerning pattern of behaviour which the proposal to demolish the Porcupine Public House in Mottingham, my constituency, highlights. It's a great concern, obviously, to the residents of Mottingham, and it's worth saying that Mottingham is not an amorphous part of London suburbia. It is a genuine village with a real sense of identity of its own, and the Porcupine Pub is a central part of that village community. But it's also worrying because the behaviour of the two substantial companies involved in this matter, I think, has potential impacts beyond this. Perhaps I can put that then into some context. The Porcupine Public House has had an inn on that site since 1688. It's not, I accept, locally or statutorily listed, but it is steeped in history. There's always been a pub there in the middle of Mottingham. It is right in the middle of the village of Mottingham, and it is virtually the one remaining bit of community space that there is in that village. So it has a very real significance to the people of the Mottingham area. Much of the local history has been there for some time. I'm told that Tom Cribb, the 19th century world bare knuckle boxing champion, trained in the Porcupine Inn. It's been called the Porcupine, I'm told, going back to the days when a spiked machine was used to crush oats and barley in alehouses. So it has a long heritage. And as I say, it's dearly loved by people in the Mottingham area. What we've seen now is, it seems to me, a frankly shabby and underhand means to close this public house against the wishes of the community. I'm delighted to see my honourable friend, the Under-Secretary of State, here to respond to the debate, and I want to thank him personally for the trouble that he took to come down to Mottingham and visit the site and meet some of the residents there. And more of that perhaps again in a moment. There are some other thank yous I'd like to raise, because the campaign to save the Porcupine Public House has had a lot of people doing a lot of hard work, and it's worth mentioning them. It's worth mentioning Liz Keeble and all the other officers and committee of the Mottingham Residents Association. They work hugely hard. Emily Bailey, who got an online petition which has gathered over 1,600 signatures. The local councillors, my Conservative colleagues, Charles Rideout and Roger Charlesley, who represent the Mottingham ward of the London Borough of Bromley, and also Councillor John Hills, who represents the adjoining ward in the neighbouring London Borough of Greenwich, just the other side of the road, virtually, from the public house. Hundreds of residents who have written in, emailed, supporting the campaign. And the 250 plus people who turned out when my honourable friend the Minister came to visit the site last week. Can I make a special thank you to David Bingley. David Bingley started the campaign. Sadly, his ongoing hospital treatment means he can't be here to watch the debate from the gallery, but I know he's going to be watching in from his hospital bed, and I'm sure you'll forgive me, Mr. Speaker, if I say we thank him for his efforts and also wish him a very speedy recovery. So that's the history of this public house and the strength of feeling. The Porcupine Public House was actually knocked down once before in 1922, and on that occasion the brewery provided a temporary pub for people to use whilst it was rebuilt. But a very different attitude adopted, I'm afraid, now. What has happened, Mr. Speaker, is essence this. The owners of the Porcupine Pub, Enterprise Inns, in my judgment, had deliberately let the pub run down and then sought to dispose of it for development. I'm afraid Enterprise Inns have a bad track record in this regard. They're becoming frankly notorious for this type of behaviour. What we have seen is that their 4 annual reports show an alarming decline in the total number of pubs it operates, declining from 7,399 in September 2009 down to 5,902 in September of 2012. It seems to me there is a deliberate policy on Enterprises Inn's part to run down its estate, and it is quite clear that having disposed of over 400 pubs in the last year, their annual report makes it clear that they are disposing of assets to pay down debt. They're a company which frankly has not had good trading results, and they seem to my mind to be behaving more like a property company than a brewing company. And what they have done in this instance adds insult to injury, because not only did they dispose of the site, they did it without any notice to the population. The site was never advertised. There was no sign that this public house was going to be closed. It literally closed overnight, having been sold, if you like, through a commercial deal with no notice to anyone to Lidl's supermarket. Lidl UK now propose to demolish the public house and erect a nondescript supermarket on the site. What I think is reprehensible is it seems to me that this pattern of conduct by Enterprise Inns is designed to circumvent the work that the government has done to give greater protection to public houses. Because the government, I think, has taken important steps through the ability to list such a place as the Porcupine as an asset of community value, and also through the greater protection in a national planning policy framework. But of course, I'll have to give way to my honourable friend.
Grateful to the Honourable General, and can I congratulate him on the campaign that he's running with the local community. And as he knows, the Porcupine pub is just across the road of Mottingham Village from my constituents, so my constituents are very concerned about this, and he has the full support of the people who are trying to save the Dutch House pub in my constituency, and this is very much a local community coming together to save both community assets. And does he agree with me that this is very much a test for the NPPF, that we should be listening to local people against these huge businesses like McDonald's and like Lidl's and like Enterprise Inns?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention, and I agree, and I welcome his support. I'm grateful to him for the support he's shown for this campaign, because we are seeing a situation where Enterprise Inns have a debt of £296 million, and they are, as I say, running down their estate to pay off that debt. They don't seem to be interested in actually running these pubs as they can be as going concerns. And so what we have seen, therefore, is the community in Mottingham was denied the opportunity to make an application to have the Porcupine listed as an asset of community value in advance because they had no notice. By the time the pub had closed, it had already changed hands and Lidl's had already moved in and boarded it up. Ironically, boarding it up with a hoarding which was beyond the size permitted under the planning regulations, as is itself in breach of development control, which says something of their attitude. But what I'd be grateful for my honourable friend to consider, perhaps when he responds, is what more we might do in relation to Enterprise Inn's behaviour in seeking to circumvent the legislation which this House put in place to protect these assets. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank my honourable friend for allowing me to intervene. And can I just say the Parliamentary Save the Pub group is entirely behind the community campaign and will offer you any support we can. But of course the simple answer, and I hope that we'll also hear this from the Minister, is twofold. First of all, the great news is, as he will know, that BIS are consulting on finally dealing with the property scam that is the Pubco model, including Enterprise Inns, and we will hear later this year that will, I hope, be dealt with. But secondly, and I hope we will start to get through to the Community Pubs Minister, because of course the Honourable Gentleman was the former Community Pubs Minister, and we have debates ourselves, is despite the fact that the Localism Act and the provisions are positive, we cannot accept a situation where the planning framework allows this sort of behaviour to go on. We must have a situation change where pubs cannot become supermarkets behind communities' pubs' backs without any consultation with the community. That cannot be right.
Almost had time to consume a pint in the course of his intervention, for which the House is grateful. Mr. Bob Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand the Honourable Gentleman's point. Again, I'm grateful for his intervention. You, Mr. Speaker, will know the importance which all communities attach to their local public house, and that's why this behaviour, it seems to me, is particularly reprehensible. It denies people the opportunity to have stepped in other places nearby, with the Baring Hall near Grove Park station, because there was notice, the community were able to get the asset listed. And of course that was denied by this underhand behaviour of Enterprise Inns, I have to say, made worse by the behaviour of Lidl. And it's becoming quite apparent that Lidl are in a business model, if you like, of acquiring public house sites and turning them into supermarkets in, again, a secretive and predatory fashion. I have to say, the Honourable Gentleman says collusion, that's what a lot of people in Mottingham would think as well. And that's been made worse by Lidl's behaviour since. They came to a public meeting organised by the Mottingham Residents Association, gave, I have to say, to put it charitably, misleading information about the status of the planning application. They claimed that they had already got permission to demolish the public house. In fact, they had not even made an application. Since then, although they claim that they wish to consult with the community, they have done no more than board the public house up. And of course, it seems to me what they want to do is to demolish so that, in effect, the past is sold and it will be impossible to rebuild a pub on that site. And that's why I'm glad to say Bromley Council are going to have to consider a Section 31 application. I'm sure that they will deal with that in an appropriate fashion. I know my honourable friend the Minister can't prejudge planning cases. I just observe that it seems to me that there are very strong planning grounds indeed to say that this is not an appropriate place for a public house. But Liddell's behaviour, I'm afraid, didn't stop there. Until I secured this debate, until I think I slightly incurred a rebuke from yourself, Mr. Speaker, for an intervention at business questions, which was perhaps a little less crisp than I try to be. Until that moment, Liddell had refused to engage at any senior level with me or any other elected representative. Liddell are a privately owned company, German-based, buying up pubs around London now and turning them into supermarkets. There is, ironically, a Liddell just 10 minutes away in Eltham, and there are already a Marks and Spencer's and a Co-op and a Sainsbury's within easy reach of this site. But I do find it extraordinary, Mr. Speaker, that having frankly misled residents with the status of the application, they took no steps to correct that. They put an application in and then forgot to pay the fee for the application for about 7 days, which says something about it. And then when I sought our meeting with a board director of Liddell's, not only did they refuse to give me the names of the directors of Liddell's, so that we had to go to Companies House to find out who they were, refused to give any name when my office contacted them, and refused to meet with me until the publicity generated by this debate. That, with respect, is a contemptuous way in which to treat the public. It does seem to me, Mr. Speaker, that there's a message for people in two respects here. First of all, they ought to know the sort of behaviour that Liddell is carrying out in this way, and in relation to enterprise inns, of course, CAMRA are being very active with their List Your Local campaign, and my message to anyone who has an enterprise